Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. I think back to when I was a teenager, experiencing so many things in life for the first time. There's a time of life to explore and to push boundaries, and we're all faced with, at some point in that exploration, hitting a boundary that we are uncomfortable with. Maybe it's a physical boundary that you know you're not supposed to cross, like going across the street or to that side of town, or maybe it's a cultural or religious boundary. But in those situations, you have to make a choice. You have a line in the sand. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a line in the sand means, quote, to establish a limit or boundary, to specify a level of tolerance or a point beyond which one will not go, end quote. So regardless of which way you go with that, by crossing the line, like crossing the Rubicon, which we did in episode 105, you are taking action that demands attention. Though, unlike crossing the Rubicon, you might still be able to come back from crossing this line, depending on the situation. So crossing a line doesn't necessarily mean that you can't come back from it, like crossing the Rubicon would, or the phrase a red line, which is another term where a red line has been drawn. And so if you go beyond the red line, then, okay, you can't come back from that, supposedly.
Okay.
And I want to mention up top that many of our examples of line in the sand are going to come with morally dubious decisions. We are not going to attempt to litigate historical ethics. In my Dan's experiences, many examples of proverbial lines drawn in the sand have moral ambiguity associated with them. That is, the right thing to do is unclear. And the line in the sand is being used in a way to try and distill that ambiguity, that lack of clarity, into a simple yes or no strategy. And Dan here, I personally feel that this is doing a disservice to whatever the ethical quandary is at the first case, that ethical issue at hand. So I think in most situations where I've seen someone trying to draw a line in the sand, they're attempting to take a complicated situation and turn it into a simple situation, which is not going to result in stand-up morals or ethics with the decision, regardless of the situation. So I think this phrase inherently comes with moral dubiousness.
Okay.
So with that moral dubiosity, which is a word I've probably just made up, covered, we're going to look at some of the ways this has been used. And I think we must acknowledge that organic beings have likely been drawing lines in the dirt, sand, and mud since they evolved the ability to hold a stick. So with that, we have to recognize that a line in the sand has probably been drawn and used for much longer than English, for sure. However, it being used as a phrase in this way is something that hasn't been around forever. And I saw one usage of the phrase that at first seemed to be simply a statement of fact and not meant to be a specific choice given to someone, though it did, in fact, turn out to be a choice. It was in the 1777 work, The Modern Traveler, Volume 5. In it, Captain Cook and a group of naturalists landed in a small cove, and they were quickly surrounded by nearly 400 indigenous peoples. And here is where we pick up the entry. Quote, the captain drew a line on the sand, telling them they were not to pass it. They presently sung their song of defiance, while a party tried to draw the boats on shore, and the line was broken on all sides. Upon this, the captain fired with small shot, end quote. So we see here, this was a literal line in the sand, but it also represented a boundary by which Captain Cook felt it was appropriate to take deadly action should it be crossed. Whether or not he was speaking the same language as the indigenous peoples or they had any sort of common understanding, I don't know. I also don't know why there were 400 of them. It definitely feels by the author's point that Captain Cook was the hero of this situation, as he defined the indigenous folks on which Captain Cook's land he had arrived as singing a song of defiance. So I don't know, but again, ethically dubious, as I said. So we're not going to debate that. Now, the first usage I could find that clearly set off a figurative usage was in the retelling of the life of Francisco Pizarro, and along with other Spanish conquistadors in a play. So this was highlighted in the 1799 work, The Spaniards in Peru, or The Death of Rolla, a tragedy in 5 acts. It was written by Augustus von Kotzebue and translated from German to English by Anne Plumptre, which was also done in 1799, so the same year this was published. Our phrase pops up early in the opening scene of the first act. The character of Elvira, speaking of Pizarro, says, quote, "But afterwards, when in the little island of Gallo, he with his sword marked a line in the sand, and magnanimously desired those of his followers who were discontented and wishes to depart to cross that line, on which permission he was deserted by all but 13 tried friends, who swore adherence to him at all hazards," end quote. Francisco Pizarro was a real person. He was a Spanish conquistador who is known in history as conquering the Incan Empire. So this play was based on a true story, though it was published over 250 years after Pizarro's death, and we have no idea if this is something that Pizarro really did. But it is a story that seems to persist because there is an 1813 work that references this account in the work called General Biography or Lives, Critical and Historical, of the most eminent persons of all ages, countries, conditions, and professions, arranged according to alphabetical order. And this was edited by John Aiken et al., which just means John Aiken and a lot of other people that I didn't want to write them all down at all. Speaking of Pizarro, he says, quote, "That leader was resolved to persist in his design, notwithstanding all discouragements. But when, after employing his eloquence in persuading his followers to partake in his fortunes, he drew a line in the sand with his swords, and permitted those to cross it who wished to return, he found himself left with no more than 13, end quote. Which means the story, true or not, became well known in the late 1700s and early 1800s, which gave rise to this phrase's figurative use of a metaphorical boundary by which some action will be taken if it is crossed.
Okay.
Here's a good example of that metaphorical or figurative usage where there is no sand involved whatsoever. This is from 1819, and it is a statement attributed to Mr. William Dundas speaking on burgh reform. It was published in the British Press out of London on May 7th, 1819. Quote, "The inhabitants of Scotland were not easily excited. They were temperate, determined, and firm. They were not easily roused, but here would call on gentlemen to beware of them. He would say to gentlemen, beware of drawing a line on the sand, lest the rising wave should not be still," end quote. So the concept here is clear. Do not draw a line in the sand and force them, the Scots, to take a side.
I think that's really, I don't know if it's intended to be, completely metaphorical or necessarily, but just that the visual of, if the rising wave should not be still is interesting. I think that's really cool.
Well, this next one comes to us from Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky during the Compromise of 1850. It is listed in the Congressional Globe for the first session of the 31st Congress, United States, and this is the volume 22, part 2. Quote, "If, therefore, I am right in these opinions which I have expressed, to run a line at 35 degrees or 36 degrees 30 minutes through California, without declaring what the effect of that line shall be, either south or north of it, would, I repeat, be running a line in the sand, a line without motive, without purpose, without accomplishing any end whatever," end quote. Senator Clay here was speaking on the Compromise of 1850, and he was an instrumental figure in it, and that was what quelled the growing unrest for over a decade until the United States' first Civil War broke out in 1860s. So it was over a decade here that this was able to basically keep folks from rioting over the decisions of slavery in the United States, which was a practice that lasted much too long. Which any time is too long,
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah.
Should never have happened in the
Too
first
long.
place, and definitely
Like,
there's never a time for it. Ever, ever, ever.
yeah.
All right, for this next one, I'm going to read from a modern article. It was written by Ryan Badger in his role as a curator of collections for the Briscoe Western Art Museum. This highlights how a phrase attributed to the 1836 falling of the Alamo wasn't published until 1873. The article clearly has some inaccuracies with the origins of the phrase, but I think it does a good job of explaining how the Alamo fits into the history of this phrase. And, I definitely heard that this phrase originated from the Alamo, and it didn't, but here we are. So I'm going to read to you some of what Ryan Badger wrote here. Quote, "Have you ever heard the expression, 'I'm drawing a line in the sand'? Have you ever wondered where that expression comes from? Look no further than the Alamo. That's right. When William Barrett Travis scratched a line in the courtyard grounds of the Alamo Fortress and invited his men to join him on one side to commit their lives to the fight against Santa Anna's army, or to stay on the other side and attempt escape, he set an idiomatic precedent that is still in use today. Remarkably, this line in the sand story, probably one of the best known anecdotes in the history of the Texas Revolution, was first published more than 40 years after the battle took place, and may have been a fabrication. Supposedly, William Zuber originally heard the story from his parents, who had taken in a disheveled man named Moses Rose shortly after the Alamo fell, and published it in 1873. Rose had told the Zubers about how Travis had drawn the line in the sand and how he alone had refused to cross and slipped away in the night, making his way east until he came to the Zuber homestead. Could it have happened? There was undoubtedly a man named Rose at the garrison, and later accounts by Susanna Dickinson mention a man named Ross fleeing the Alamo just before the battle. Still, other accounts record all adult men, with the exception of Joe, dying in battle. Unfortunately, there is no way to know for sure, but whether the story is true or not, the image of a resolute Travis drawing his line in the sand, either figurative or literal, will be one of the reasons people continue to remember the Alamo." End quote. So we're going to talk more about some of the other myths and legends that are surrounding the Alamo, including how over 20 people, including Travis's personal slave Joe, survived. And we'll talk about those in our behind the scenes video, which is available every Friday on our Patreon. That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. But for now, we're going to move to New York with the July 9th, 1896 edition of The Journal. This is in an article called Convention Stories of Great Men, such called because it was noting who was at the Republican Convention and a little about them. And thus we find Mr. Beriah Wilkins, publisher of the Washington Post, in attendance. The article speaks of Wilkins' war record, presumably during the Civil War. He has a 60-day enlistment along with many men of Ohio, and they dug a readout that was, according to his account, impregnable. And when the 60 days were up, a colonel came a-calling to ask the men to re-enlist. After no one spoke for a time, Mr. Wilkins, then a young man, stepped up. Quote, "Like Pizarro, on a similar occasion, when settling all things Peruvian, Mr. Wilkins drew his shovel and marked a line in the sand. 'Comrades,' shouted Mr. Wilkins, while his eyes flashed like a falchion, 'on this side of the line lie Ohio, 3 meals a day and safety. On this,' and here the intrepid young hero pointed southward with his keen shovel, 'on this lie privation, sow belly, and a soldier's grave. Which will we embrace? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me the safe Ohio, sure thing end of it. My mind's made up. Nothing can swerve me now.' With these words, Mr. Wilkins crossed over to the Ohio side of the line and broke his shovel against a tree, saying, 'So end all my battles, all my dreams of glory.' Carried away by his example, the entire regiment followed Mr. Wilkins. They returned to Ohio as one man." End quote. So I think this is important because the author here draws on Francisco Pizarro's experience here. It was only 30 years following the Battle of the Alamo. So it seems the Alamo would have been a better example had it been widely known. But instead, he references a Spanish conquistador who had been dead for over 350 years. Which makes me feel like the line in the sand popularity from the Alamo story may be more modern myth making than anything else.
Uh,
Regardless of the origin, I do think this story coming from the Alamo has helped repopularize an old phrase. And the reason I say that is because, according to Google's Ngram, the line in the sand phrase didn't really start to make much of a comeback until 1986, when it began popping up in congressional records and then in public vernacular alike. What happened in 1986? Well, that was the sesquicentennial of the Battle of the Alamo, the 150-year anniversary. I may actually still have a commemorative tin from these celebrations. So it was a big deal, and it was a big deal across the nation. And the story of Travis's line in the sand, true or not, certainly not well known in its time, was too good of a political story to pass up. And so the phrase that had been associated with the Spanish conquistador in Peru traveled 3,000 miles and several centuries northward to be reimagined for the Alamo for all of these politicians who wanted to talk about drawing lines in the sand for their political gain and to make the process look good. And that is why we have line in the sand as a modern use once again, and we're going to talk about those modern uses right after we say thank you to our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons on Patreon, and it is 100% free to join the Bunny Trails community. So give our weekly discussions and poll questions a try. And if you love the content and want more of it, we have some paid tiers too if you have a few dollars to spare each month and want to support the show.
We have new things every weekday on the feeds. In addition to the conversation about what movies, shows, books, and podcasts everyone is enjoying, and our weekly poll questions, we also have early access to the week's podcast, all the links, books, songs, and other content mentioned in the week's episode, and our lightly edited behind-the-scenes video featuring all of the cut content, goofs, and bonus facts that didn't make it into the podcast feed.
We've also got original digital artwork every month made by me and direct access to talk with us. No nefarious social media algorithms getting in the way of what we see or don't see. Plus, you can get awesome name recognition like Pat Rowe and JGP do every episode. And our top spot is currently occupied by the amazing Mary Halsey Lopez. You can join the Bunny Trails community for free at Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon. That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod.
We'll start our modern uses with Lines in the Sand, a 1997 rock song by Dream Theater. Here's the last line and the final chorus. Quote, "Sometimes, in the wreckage of our wake, there's a bitterness we harbor and hate for hatred's sake. Sometime, we dig an early grave and crucify our instincts for the hope we couldn't save. Sometimes, a view from sinless eyes centers our perspective and pacifies our cries. Sometimes, the anguish we survive and the mysteries we nurture are the fabrics of our lives. Swept away with the tide through the holes in my hands, crown of thorns at my side, drawing lines in the sand." End quote. That felt very Garrison Keillor to me just now.
It was like, had that. Yeah. Yeah, very, it's like all meaningful and or
Right.
poetic, whatever, but in a very like kind of more down to earth sort of way.
Yeah, I nailed the meter on that one. Hooray for me! Hey! So this next one is a play on the phrase and is called Line in the Dust. It is a song by Bruce Hornsby off of his 1998 album Spirit Trail. It's about a person meeting up with an old childhood friend and realizing they hold opinions that are problematic in the singer's eyes. I think most of us can relate to that at some point in our lives. Here are some of the lyrics. Quote, "Between us, I can see things are not what they used to be. My old friend changed, or maybe it was me. Things get so complicated, jokes made, friendships dissipated. Long silence, but I speak, now so belated. I say, hey, wait a minute. What's that you said? Not so sure I heard you right. Whoa, oh hey, wait a minute. Oh, say that again? You're in the dust, drawing a long straight line." End quote. All right, we'll start our books with a novel called A Line in the Sand by Gerald Seymour. Here's the synopsis from the publisher. Quote, "Just when he was beginning to feel safe, Frank Perry's past has surfaced with a vengeance. 10 years ago, Perry made powerful enemies by spying for the British government on Iranian chemical and biological weapons installations. His information served to cripple Iran's killing capacity for years, and now Iran is exacting its revenge and dispatching its most deadly assassin to do the job. Codenamed Anvil, the assassin moves with stealth towards Perry's asylum on the coast of Suffolk. As elaborate preparations are made to ensure Perry's safety, an unexpected new threat arises in the form of the local citizenry. Fearing for their lives, the community closes ranks against him, and Perry is left to fend for himself against a remorseless, faceless adversary. End quote. So that book was released in 99 and 2000, depending on which country. Interestingly, the novel was so popular it was adapted into a two-part miniseries for the British station ITV. It was set to air in 2001, but given the plot line with Middle Eastern back and forths, ITV felt like that the recent attacks in the United States of September of 2001 made it just something they didn't want to touch right now, and so the project didn't actually air. The miniseries didn't actually air until 2004. So it was a very successful book that was released in 99 in some countries and 2000 in others. It was so popular in Britain that they made a mini-series about it in 2001, but then they didn't air it until 2004 due to those attacks. Next up is the 2002 work, A Line in the Sand, The Alamo in Blood and Memory by Randy Roberts and James S. Olson. Here's the synopsis from the publisher, quote, in late February and early March of 1836, the Mexican army, under the command of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, besieged a small force of Anglo and Tejano rebels at a mission known as the Alamo. The defenders of the Alamo were in an impossible situation. They knew very little of the events taking place outside the mission walls. They did not have much of an understanding of Santa Anna or his government in Mexico City. They sent out contradictory messages. They received contradictory communications. They moved blindly and planned in the dark. And in the dark early morning of March 6th, they died. In that brief, confusing, and deadly encounter, one of America's most potent symbols was born. The story of the last stand at the Alamo grew from a Texas rallying cry to a national slogan to a phenomenon of popular culture and presidential politics. Yet it had been hotly contested symbol from the first. Questions remain about what really happened. Did William Travis really draw a line in the sand? Did Davy Crockett die fighting, surrounded by the bodies of 24 of the enemy? And what of the participants' motives and purposes? Were the Texans justified in their rebellion? Were they sincere patriots making a last stand for freedom and liberty? Or were they a ragtag collection of greedy men on the make, washed-up politicians and backwood bullies? Americans bent on extending American slavery into a foreign land? The full story of the Alamo, from the weeks and months that led up to the fateful encounter to the movies and speeches that continue to remember it today, is a quintessential story of America's past and a fascinating window into our collective memory. In A Line in the Sand, acclaimed historians Randy Roberts and James Olson use a wealth of archival sources, including the diary of Jose Enrique de la Peña, along with important and little-used Mexican documents, to retell the story of the Alamo for a new generation of Americans. They explain what happened from the perspective of all parties, not just Anglo and Mexican soldiers, but also Tejano allies and bystanders. They delve anew into the mysteries of Crockett's final hours and Travis's famous rhetoric. Finally, they show how preservationists, television and movie producers, historians, and politicians have become the Alamo's major interpreters. Walt Disney, John Wayne, and scores of journalists and cultural critics have used the Alamo to contest the very meaning of America, and thereby helped us all to remember the Alamo. End quote. Here's another book. This one is 2021's A Red Line in the Sand, Diplomacy, Strategy, and the History of Wars That Might Still Happen by David A. Andelman. A seemingly prescient title, given that since this book's publication, more than one superpower has invaded other smaller countries, sparking fears of World War III. Anyway, here's a synopsis from the publisher. Quote, a longtime CNN columnist astutely combines history and global politics to help us better understand the exploding number of military, political, and diplomatic crises around the globe. The riveting and illuminating behind the scenes stories of the world's most intense red lines, from diplomatic and military changes at particular turning points in history to the ones that set the tone of geopolitics today. Whether it was the Red Line in Munich that led to the start of the Second World War, or to the Red Line in the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, Syria, and the Middle East. As we traverse the globe, Andelman uses original documentary research, previously classified material, and interviews with key players to help us understand the growth, the successes, and frequent failures that have shaped our world today. Andelman provides not just vivid historical context, but a political anatomy of these red lines. How might their failures be prevented going forward? When and how can such lines in the sand help preserve peace rather than tempt conflict? A red line in the sand is a vital examination of our present and the future. Where does diplomacy end and war begin? It is an object lesson of tantamount importance to every leader, diplomat, citizen, and voter. As America establishes more red lines than it is pledged to defend, every American should understand the volatile atmosphere and the existential stakes of the red web that encompasses the globe. End quote. So the title I thought was very interesting, and the synopsis does this as well, where it combines the concept of a red line, which the OED notes means, quote, a notional boundary that should not or will not be crossed, a limit or point beyond which specified actions will not be tolerated or concessions will not be made, end quote. So it combines that red line as a thing you can't cross this with our phrase, a line in the sand. And I think they capture very well the way that a red line has been used as rhetoric now. They've crossed a red line, but we don't seem to be doing anything about it, right? And he captures that with more red lines than we can defend. All right, we're going to close out with this one here as Beyond Salvation 3, A Line in the Sand. And it's an ink on paper drawing by Roger Adamson of the United Kingdom. It was completed in 2025, and here's a description of the work from Saatchi Art. Quote, a huge explosion rocks a nearby ship, but the wire carriers running out the lines barely look up. Gas cutters rely on lines being purged of anything flammable, but when they cut them, what's left inside frequently ignites, together with the gas tanks they carry. The consequences are deadly. On 7th September 2004, 6 men died when the MT Suvarna Savaja exploded despite being certified gas-free for man entry and hot work by the Bangladeshi government, in a yard certified by Japan's Class Society under the Hong Kong Convention that was meant to represent a line in the sand. End quote.
Wow.
So this work depicts exactly what he just said. There's an explosion happening, but these folks carrying this large wire don't even look up as this explosion happens. The implication being that it happens with such frequency, even though the Hong Kong Convention was meant to represent a line in the sand to stop this kind of thing. Yeah. But even with the Bangladeshi government saying that this is corrected, and Japan's class society, a yard certified by them, that it still is happening, despite a line in the sand. So it's pretty powerful between the art itself and knowing the background of its origin.
It really is, and it's really intricately drawn. It's pretty impressive for ink on paper.
Yeah,
it's really good work.
Well, as I said at the top, I'm not a fan of drawing metaphorical lines in the sand because it tries to reduce the complex moral or ethical dilemmas into a simple yes or no decision. And while that might be acceptable in a time of crisis where second matters, it isn't acceptable in most other situations. As the Brothers Green say, truth resists simplicity. In most situations, we're better off to deliberate and discuss these moral choices at length rather than forcing a decision with a line in the sand. That's about all we have for today. If you have any thoughts on the show or pop culture references we should have included, reach out to us on Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com.
It is poll time. Recently, we asked our patrons, when you listen to podcasts, do you finish every episode or do you skip around? The 2 most popular answers were, I'm willing to skip around if it doesn't grab me, and finish every time. Mary said, quote, I do it all. I like to binge bunny trails on longer drives because I mostly listen to podcasts in my car and I want to hear the whole episode at once. With political podcasts like Midas Touch or Brian Tyler Cohen, I pick and choose based on the topic and guest. I always listen when they have Jamie Raskin or Janine Crockett. I never miss John Oliver, although that's really not a podcast. I dabble in many others with comedy, watercolor, healthcare, and history as their focus. I am a podcast junkie, end quote. Dustin noted, quote, I like to hear the whole thing, sometimes multiple times if it is really dense. The history of English is one I have to listen to multiple times, end quote. Cheryl said, quote, I listen to so many podcasts and I'm always behind, so I can't take the time to listen to ones that aren't of interest, end quote. Good point, Cheryl.
Heather said, quote, if I'm following a podcast, I generally listen to it all. The exception is review podcasts, if I'm not interested in the media they talk about on specific episodes, end quote. JGP noted, quote, it depends very much on the podcast for me. There are many that are more of the kind where the subject changes each episode, depending on who the host is interviewing or what they'd researched for that episode. And life is just too short to listen to interviews or topics I'm uninterested in or find unpleasant, end quote. So yes, I would say I agree. Like most of you, my answer really depends on the podcast. I do have some, like My Brother and Me, that I listen to every normal episode, but I skip the live shows and when they have guests, because that just doesn't interest me. Some, like Sandman Stories Presents, that I listen to from start to finish, no matter what. And then others, like This Day in History with the Retrospectors, where I listen if the topic is appealing. So it really does just depend for me. But as many of you have said, there are so many podcasts and so little time that everyone should feel empowered to listen in whatever way makes the most sense for them.
If I like the podcast, I'm an every episode type, and usually from the very beginning of the whole show. Like I'll start at the very first episode.
We call that binging.
Yeah. But there are some that I'll just hop on and listen like to one episode, particularly if they are interview style or if the episodes have varying topics, then I'll just listen to the ones I'm interested in and sometimes just a portion of it. If you want to take part in our silly polls, head over to Patreon. We'd love to hear your take on our weekly poll questions, and it's free at patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Until then, remember,
Words belong to their users.